Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is leadership. Leadership in Israel and the responses of leadership in the diaspora to the present leadership in Israel. I want to point out that this is not the first time that a conservative government has been formed in Israel. It might be worth looking at those other governments and then looking at this new Israeli government through that lens.
We want peace, all of us want peace. We want an agreement of peace with our neighbors.
When Menachem Begin was elected Israeli Prime Minister in 1977, no one imagined that he, the epitome of a right-winger, would bring about the Camp David Accords. And yet, it was Begin who brokered peace between Israel and Egypt. In 1983, and then again in 1986, when Yitzhak Shamir was elected Prime Minister of Israel, liberals were very upset. And yet, in 1983, it was Shamir who negotiated the agreement to end the war in Lebanon. And in 1991, it was Shamir who led Israel's delegation to the Madrid peace talks, the precursor to the Oslo Accords. Ariel Sharon was the hawk's hawk. During his tenure as Israel's prime minister, he turned into a dove. In 2001, in that election to office, sent American liberals into a tizzy. And yet, August 2005, Sharon unilaterally withdrew all Israeli settlers and the army from the Gaza and handed the entire area of Gaza to the Palestinians. Turnkey, settlers and soldiers just up and left. Flowers still in their greenhouses. Sharon handed all of Gaza to the Palestinian Authority. These were all right-wing Israeli governments. They all had their problems, but they had their good points too. Like all Israeli governments, the Prime Minister rose to the occasion at the moment. It is a given fact that many Americans, from the White House down to people on the street, have difficulty with Israel's conservative policies, regardless of the ruling party and government in Jerusalem. The United States feels the need to advise and warn and chide Israel about their internal and foreign policies. It's a patronizing relationship that has developed over the years. It's akin to the relationship between older and younger siblings. It can be very irritating at times. The U.S. characterizes it as a relationship based on friendship. At first glance, this new Israeli government does seem different. The Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, is a known commodity, having held the premiership more often than any other Israeli in all of Israel's history. And that scares the United States, it scares U.S. Jewry, it scares U.S. politic alike. This newly elected government promises to reform the judiciary. They feel it gives overwhelming power over the legislative and executive branches of government. This newly elected government wants to neuter that power by empowering the legislature to override Supreme Court rulings with a simple majority vote of 61 out of the 120 votes in the Knesset. The effect would be to render the Supreme Court totally powerless as a check in the balance of power in Israel. A more modest and effective path, with a better chance of passing a Knesset vote, by the way, would be to have a 2/3 majority vote in the legislature to overrule. 2/3 would illustrate that the overwhelming majority of the legislature disagrees with the decision of the Supreme Court. But they're not asking my opinion on the matter. It is a mistake for the new government to hope to reform the justice system and defang the Supreme Court. It would truly alter the very nature of Israel's democracy. The independence of the judiciary is an essential part of the balance of power. Some argue that the people's voice is the legislature, not the voices of the elite, hyper-educated judiciary. But unlike in the United States, justices in the Israeli Supreme Court have an age limit. Mandatory retirement is at age 70. There is a constant injection of new people. Of the 15 justices on the Supreme Court, 6 are women, 1 is Arab. 1 was born in the US, 1 in the UK, 1 in Moldova, the former Soviet Republic. So what's irking the White House? Let's look at the Israeli response to the Palestinian Authority orchestrating a UN, United Nations vote, held on December 30th to take Israel to the World Court. Israel's response was to launch a series of actions against PA leadership. In response, Israel has withdrawn the special travel permits of PA VIPs to travel freely in and out of Israel and around Israel. When, for example, the PA Foreign Minister, Riyad al-Maliki, was returning from Europe via Amman, Jordan, he was stuck at the Allenby Bridge. Israel maintains that border, and they asked him to please get in line with everyone else. No more VIP status for the PA Foreign Minister. If the PA is aggressively suing Israel reasons, there is no reason Israel should extend VIP status to their representatives. Sounds reasonable enough. Here's another Israeli response, which irks the United States. Israel will not transfer the $40 million per month in taxes they collect for the PA at Israeli ports. Why? Because the Palestinian Authority continues to pay terrorists and their families who have murdered Israelis. It's called pay to slay. The decision to withhold the taxes was passed into Israeli law years ago. Only now it is being applied. It's perfectly legal within the Israeli system. The lesson is there are local consequences to the PA's international steps. They need to know that. The bottom line is that in many ways, this government is defining itself. This new government will make mistakes. Every government makes mistakes. But let's wait until those mistakes are made before the brutal critique and condemnation gushes forth. Remember, their forebearers, Begin, Shamir, and Sharon, were also right-wingers. Coming up next, points of view. First up is a column from the Jerusalem Post. It was written by Mark Greendorfer and was published on January 15, 2023. It's entitled, "Even the PLO Knows the Jews Are Indigenous to Israel." Subtitled, "PLO knew they could not erase history, so they chose instead to rewrite history." The battle of who owns history has been going on for quite some time. The same arguments cycle through now and then and all the time. This particular argument, as presented by Greendorfer, is important. It is in response to the Palestinians saying that there is no Jewish history in Jerusalem. Often the response is to shout that there is no such thing as a Palestinian. Of course, they are both patently false. There is no doubt about a great Jewish history in Jerusalem, and indeed Palestinians too have a history. Theirs is a modern history, but there is also a rich, strong, significant Muslim Arab history in the Holy Land. This is how Greendorfer begins. The Jewish people originated in and are indigenous to what is now the modern state of Israel. Jews are from Judea. Even the masterminds of the Palestinian terrorism, those who founded the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, understood and acknowledged this fact when they drafted their charter in the 1960s, which tellingly states, "Palestine is the homeland of the Arab Palestinian people." Why did they refer to Arab Palestinian people rather than just Palestinian people? The answer is that even the PLO knew that they couldn't erase history, so they chose instead to rewrite history. This is something they could continue to do to this day, with many anti-Israel activists insisting that Jews are European occupiers of a land to which they have no right, a ludicrous claim on its face, given the fact that the majority of Israeli Jews are not of European descent. Now Greendorfer continues to explain how the PLO Charter defines the Palestinian. He writes, "To deal with the inconvenient historical fact that Jews are the indigenous population of Israel, the drafters of the PLO Charter created an arbitrary dividing line to determine who would be considered a Palestinian. First, the PLO Charter deems any Arab who had lived in the entirety of what is now modern Israel prior to the reestablishment of the Jewish homeland to automatically be Palestinian, without regard to whether they were residents in the land. Further, the PLO Charter deemed any Arab, but not Jews, born after 1947 to a Palestinian father to be a Palestinian." Greendorfer concludes by writing that the Palestinians are the colonists and the settlers, and that Israel has taken them in politely. The Palestinians, he writes, the only way that anti-Israel activists can strip Jews of our status as indigenous people of the land and eliminate Jewish self-determination is to do as the Palestinian Charter did, ignore history and designate a time when Jews had been ethnically cleansed from our own homeland as the point in time when Jewish history in Israel starts. There are settler colonists in Israel, and they are Palestinian Arabs. Nonetheless, Israel welcomes these settler colonists and provides them with rights that no other country would provide to invaders and occupiers. It's time for Palestinian Arab activists and their supporters to accept history and thank Israel for the gracious hospitality extended to newcomers. This is an interesting way of looking at things. Like most of these discussions, however, this thesis does not advance a solution. It just puts people in their position. Next up is a column from Fox News. It was written by Gabriel Hayes and was published on January 16, 2023. It's entitled, University of Michigan Rally Calling for Intifada, Demise of Israel Stuns Internet, a Call to Murder Jews. This column describes a protest at University of Michigan in Ann Arbor that calls for the destruction of Israel and the murder of Jews. Hayes begins, social media users were shocked and outraged over a recent anti-Israel rally put on by pro-Palestinian protesters at the University of Michigan this week. Clips of the protest depicted marchers chanting Intifada, Intifada, long live the Intifada, a call to violent overthrow of the Jewish state inspired by Palestinian riots and rebellions against Israel in the late 80s and early 90s and early 2000s. There is only one solution, a female marcher was seen chanting, as the crowd behind her responded, Intifada Revolution. Marchers were walking around the Ann Arbor campus screaming into bullhorns and waving Palestinian flags. Were also heard chanting the infamous anti-Israel call to arms. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Media reported that the anti-Semitic rally was held to protest Vice President Kamala Harris's Thursday visit to the campus, where she gave a speech on climate policy and student activism. The protesters appeared to be standing against U.S. government support for the State of Israel. Another video depicted the marchers outside of campus building in which Harris was giving her speech, saying, "Not another nickel, not another dime, no more money for Israel's crimes." This entire episode is frightening. It shows us a mere sliver of what Jewish students today experience on campuses across America. Again, this is frightening, very frightening. And Hayes concludes with the following. Hollywood producer and The Spectator columnist Daniela Greenbaum Davis empathized with the Jewish students at the University of Michigan. She tweeted, "The first and second Intifada saw terrorists brutally murder innocent civilians. Can't imagine being a Jew on Michigan's campus right now." I've got to tell you, I absolutely agree. It must be frightening. Coming up, commentary through cartoons where pictures tell the story. I want to show you 4 cartoons today. The first 3 cartoons poke fun at the astronomical increase in the price of eggs. If this continues, the price of an omelet will soon rival the cost of a steak dinner, there's no doubt. Our first cartoon has a fancy-looking expert holding up a Fabergé egg. He is explaining that it has high value, and due to its scarcity, the chicken holding her egg responds, "Ditto." Next up is a guy on one knee proposing to a woman, not with the traditional diamond ring, but instead with a dozen eggs, and she shouts, "Yes!" You can imagine that. The value of eggs are that expensive. For the third cartoon, we see a husband and wife having coffee around the table. He's reading the newspaper. It reads, "Price of eggs skyrocketing." He says to her, "Don't worry, I made some adjustments to our retirement plan, and our nest egg is now literally an egg." Finally, this last cartoon is about Iran, where leadership is executing anti-government protesters. The cartoon is drawn by a character named Paresh. He's from India, New Delhi, but his work is carried across the world, especially the United Arab Emirates and Dubai, in media throughout the Arab and Muslim world. On the tank is written, Iran, and 3 men are hanging from makeshift gallows, and the 4th is being lassoed in. In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. The figures for Israel's poverty rate in 2021 have been released, and the numbers are disheartening. Poverty in Israel increased to 20%, making Israel, according to a report by Israel's Insurance Institute, the NII, the second poorest among developed countries after Costa Rica. Israeli citizens have felt the squeeze of inflation and economic malaise since 2020, when COVID-19 pandemic pushed the countries, like others, to impose prolonged lockdowns. According to the NII, the National Insurance Institute, 26% more than 1 in 4, that means, Israeli families struggled to cover monthly expenses in 2021. Almost 10.6% of Israeli households could not afford medical treatment in 2021, and nearly 7% could not afford to buy medication. In 2021, according to the NII, 1 in 5 Israelis was living under the poverty line, with individuals making less than 2,849 shekels, that's $830 monthly, and families caring for 2 to 4 children making less than 9,117 shekel, that's $2,560. In total, 2 million Israelis lived under the poverty line in 2021, including 850,000 children and 213,000 elderly. In response, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vowed to freeze the prices on certain goods like water, fuel, on electricity, to reduce the cost. Yarona Shalom, Director General of the National Insurance Institute, explained the situation this way. To deal with the disparities in society, an increase in allowances is required, on the one hand, and on the other hand, providing tools and assistance to families and individuals who are in labor market but whose salary is low. 8 ostrich eggs dating back over 4,000 years, laying beside an ancient fire pit, were discovered in the Nitzana sand dunes in Israel's Negev region. The fire pit is located on an ancient campsite that covers about 200 square meters. The announcement was sent out by the Israeli Antiquities Authority. In reality, this find may actually date back 7,500 years. That's how long. According to Lauren Davis, the Israeli Antiquities Authority Excavation Director, the campsite, quote, was used by the desert nomads since prehistoric times, unquote. She described the archaeology and the archaeological find this way. At the site we found burnt stones, flint and stone tools, as well as pottery shards. But the truly special find is this collection of ostrich eggs. Although the nomads did not build permanent structures at this site, the find allows us to feel their presence in the desert. Archaeologists explain it was easy to lose sight of these ancient campsites as the sand dunes quickly covered them up and hid them below the sand. They were only rediscovered with the shifting of the sand over the course of thousands of years, bringing them to the surface once more. According to Davis, that is what exactly caused this exceptional preservation of the eggs, which has allowed the researchers a glimpse into the lives of nomads who roamed the desert in ancient times. After the excavation, we will reconstruct the eggs just like a puzzle. The whole egg may tell us the species and exactly what they were used for. As far as I'm concerned, every eggshell is worth its weight in gold. Israelis flock to 7-Eleven as it opens its first store in Israel, and more are on the way. Electro Consumer Products, a franchise of 7-Eleven International, has opened its first 7-Eleven in Tel Aviv at the Dizengoff Center Mall. The store will serve Israel's second largest city and largest metropolitan area. 7-Eleven's entrance into Israel is part of a 20-year master franchise agreement that was signed last year between 7-Eleven International and Electra consumer products. 7 more stores are slated to be opened. Ken Wakabayashi, CEO of 7-Eleven International, said, and this is a quote, "With its thriving economy and growing population, Israel offers an excellent environment for 7-Eleven's first retail venture in the region. Our entrance into the country brings Israeli customers a one-stop shop solution with quality fresh food and convenience needs via a store format not currently prevalent in the market. We were excited to provide citizens and tourists alike with world-class convenience." The single-story store in Tel Aviv will resemble other 7-Elevens and serve a variety of their internationally popular products and beverages, including coffee, their famous Slurpee, and Big Gulp drinks. Local delicacies created to appeal to the surrounding neighborhood will also be available. The Tel Aviv 7-Eleven will also sell a wide variety of fresh kosher foods developed specifically for the Israeli taste and preferences. Offerings will include fresh sandwiches, traditional salads, sausages with locally sourced sauces and toppings. The store will also feature a variety of hot food products such as za'atar pita, kube, and fatayr. I-24 News reported that a popular Iranian Shiite mullah, a well-known critic of the Iranian regime, paid a secret visit to Israel and met with officials close to the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. In a conversation with I-24 News, the mullah did not deny the visit and even spoke of his friendship with an official close to the Prime Minister. This is big news. First, it puts the mullah's life at risk. Second, the very important aspect is that it illustrates that there are even more cracks in Iran's authoritarian leadership and government than we had thought. In a series of farewell interviews, Israel's outgoing army chief, Avi Kochavi, said that Israel has a 3-pronged operational plan to attack Iran and neutralize its nuclear program. Days before being replaced by Herzi Halevi, his successor, Israel's military chief of staff, Avi Kochavi, said that Iran has an active weapons team and has been working at a very slow pace, and this is in violation of the nuclear deal. According to Kochavi, Iran currently has enough fissile material to produce 4 bombs using highly enriched uranium. This announcement is highly unusual. It is very specific. The information is the kind of thing spoken about behind closed doors and not in public. Paul Johnson, the distinguished British author, historian, and journalist, and great lover of Israel and the Jewish people, has died. He was 94 years old. His book, A History of the Jews, published in 1987, became an international bestseller. The book was poetic. His support for Israel remained strong and unwavering throughout his entire life. Paul Johnson was a Roman Catholic who, in addition to writing The History of the Jews, published many other books of history, including The History of the Modern World in 1983, which was another bestseller, and A History of the American People, 1997, another bestseller. Johnson's early education was at a Catholic public school. He later went on to Magdalen College, part of Oxford University. He chose to become a journalist and joined the left-wing weekly The New Statesman, where in 1965 he was appointed the editor. Under his leadership, The Statesman achieved the highest ever circulation of 94,000 readers. In 1970, Johnson left the publication and became a prolific columnist and commentator for many newspapers and magazines, notably the Daily Mail and the Spectator. It was then that he also embarked on his career as a historian. Having started out as a keen supporter of British Labour Party, Johnson gradually moved towards the right, largely as a result of his opposition to the power and influence of the trade unions in the 1970s in Great Britain. Paul Johnson became one of Margaret Thatcher's most fervent supporters. He was an advisor to her during her tenure as Prime Minister and even helped compose several of her speeches. Johnson rose to international fame in 2006. President George W. Bush, an admirer of Johnson, awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom. In 2016, he was knighted by the Queen. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. Did you know that the word in Hebrew for history is historia? Hardly a Hebrew word, right? Historia? That's not a Hebrew word. It's Greek and it's Latin. Earlier I spoke about the great historian Paul Johnson. He was really a reteller or a teller of history, a marvelous wordsmith. Johnson was not a researcher using primary sources. Instead, he culled through secondary sources and crafted beautiful stories. The word historia in Hebrew comes from the Greek and the Latin. Both are the same sounding word, but they mean two completely different things. Historia in Greek means knowledge, knowledge through inquiry. Historia in Latin means more like what we think of history, a retelling of the past. History, as we know it, is a science and research. It is a drive to find out what happened in the past using sources. The Hebraic terms mean more like chronicles. For instance, Divrei Yamim, things that happened in the past, or Toldot, which is more of a chronology, or Korot, which are things that happened. Jews are obsessed with the past, obsessed with memory. In many ways, for us, memory and tradition are more important than history itself. What actually happened is less important than the memories as they are retold and recounted through the generations. Those memories shape our traditions. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.